Incentive Program webinar in just a moment. Albert, I know I talked to you about being my sound check. Are you going to call in, or are you using a mic? Can you type an answer to that, I guess? Anyway, we'll go ahead. I'll give him another minute and get another minute for people to get started. So just hold on. Thank you. Okay, well, it appears people can hear us, and so we're going to get started. Again, my name is Allison Schuster, and I'm the Associate Director for Performance Measurement. And I have with me today Diane Feeney and Elsa Haile from the HSCRC as well as Scott Afzal on the line from CRISP, because he'll be talking about how we use the CRISP unique identifier for our readmissions program. Again, before I get started, this webinar is being recorded, and we will eventually post it onto the HSCRC website. So for people who can't attend in person, they can listen to it, as well as they can, you can listen to it again. We are in the process right now of setting up a web page for this program. There isn't currently one, so I apologize. I sent out the slides. I did make a couple minor modifications, nothing to the substance. But as you're going through, you might notice those. And once we do have the website set up, we will post these slides and the webinar. Also, just for a process, everybody is muted. However, I can unmute people to ask questions. It's better if you have called in and are using the phone rather than your computer, although okay, yeah, it's better if you're using your phone rather than your computer, because there's sometimes some feedback. What I'm going to do is you should feel free during the presentation to ask questions. However, I will try to pause to capture those questions. However, if I miss something, I'll come back at the end and make sure I've addressed all questions. Or there may be some questions that I choose to just hold off on because I'm going to cover them still. So with that being said, we'll get started. Hopefully we won't have any technical issues. If we do have technical issues, you can also type those in as well, and we will get them fixed. So let's get started. So the webinar agenda is as follows. First, I'm going to just give an overview of the readmissions program and its guiding principles. Then we're going to review the specific program targets for rate year 2016. We will then walk through the measurement methodology, how we're going to measure readmissions for this program. After that, we're going to open the readmissions Excel workbook that hospitals will be receiving on a monthly basis and just walk through the various tabs that are included in there. We will then go over what are going to be the program reporting timelines for the preliminary and final data and our reports to you with your readmissions rates. And then Scott will briefly present about the CRISP unique identifier and how we are using that for this program. Okay, so background and guiding principles. So first, let me just tell you about the rationale from this, behind this program and how it was developed. As you probably know, Maryland's readmission rates are high compared to the rest of the U.S. And in the CMMI all-payer model demonstration contract, there are actually specific readmissions targets that we have to hit. And that is actually for Medicare in Maryland, we have to get to being at or below the average national Medicare rate by the end of the 5-year demonstration project. In order to achieve this goal, the HSCRC staff and the performance measurement work group, which includes stakeholders from various groups such as hospitals, the Hospital Association, payers, etc. What we did was we met starting in January and developed and vetted a methodology for this program that was then presented and approved by the Commission in April 2014. I'll go into this a little bit more in detail, but what this means is actually this is going to impact rates in fiscal year 16 or rate year 16, which means we're actually in the performance period now. And I'll walk through that again, but I just want everybody to be aware of that. So again, this is Delmarva data just showing the unadjusted Medicare all-cause readmissions rates for Maryland here in gray and for the nation as a whole. As you can see, Maryland is at about a little bit less than 19% in the last quarter, or the third quarter of calendar year 2013, while the national rate was close to like 17%. In addition to the sort of all-cause readmission rates being high in Maryland, we also have high rates for the CMS condition-specific measures, and those are for pneumonia, heart failure, and heart attack. And what this table here shows is that, you know, for pneumonia, 29 of the hospitals were in the lowest quartile in terms of they had the most excess readmissions, comparing it to the rest of the nation. So as you can see, we have a lot of hospitals in the lowest quartile. In addition, 4 Maryland hospitals were ranked among the worst 100 hospitals in the nation for each of these 3 conditions. And for pneumonia, about 1/5 of the hospitals were ranked in the worst 200 hospitals in the nation. Now, this data is a little bit old. It's from 2008 through 2011. However, I just want to point this out because, you know, if our programs don't show the improvement or reduction in readmissions that CMS is looking for in our CMMI contract, it may be that Maryland hospitals wouldn't be given an exemption for the CMS readmission program, and then we may be ranked on some of these things. So that's one of the reasons it matters, as well as the fact that it's a potential quality issue and a source of unnecessary spending. So I talked about the overall goal in 5 years that we have to be at the national Medicare rate. However, we also have to show annual reductions. And specifically in the contract with CMMI, it says that if in a given performance year, Maryland hospitals as a whole fail to outperform the national readmission rate change by an amount equal to or greater than the cumulative difference between the Maryland and the national rate, divided by 5, CMS shall follow the corrective action or termination provisions that are outlined in the contract. So again, we need to hold on. I just lost my my apologies. I lost my slides for a second. Okay. So again, every year we need to be showing some improvement, and we've set up this program. While we don't have this exact number yet, we're working with CMMI to calculate the exact Maryland and national rate during the base year. We believe this program has been set up so that the reduction amount will be more than sufficient to hit this annual goal. So here I'm just going to list sort of the guiding principles that the staff and the performance measurement work group came up with as they developed the program. First, they said that measurement should be based, measurement used for performance that is linked with payment must include all patients regardless of payer. So as part of our CMMI contract, our quality programs do need to apply not just to Medicare, but to the all-payer, to all payers even though in this case our goal is a Medicare-specific target. And we have shown data that shows that as the all-payer readmission rates go up or down, Medicare readmission rates are very highly correlated with that, so they're related. So we believe if we reduce readmissions for all payers, Medicare readmissions are going to go down. Next, measurement has to be fair to all hospitals, and as we go through the measurement methodology, I'm going to highlight some of the things that we do, like the removal of planned readmissions that are done to ensure that it's fair to each hospital. Next, as a guiding principle, we said that the first-year target had to be established to reasonably support the overall goal of getting to the national rate by 2018. So we actually modeled various different scenarios out 1 to, through 5 years to try to estimate where we thought Medicare was going to be in 5 years and what we would need to do to get to that. In the end, we decided to just go with estimating out 1 year at a time because there's been a lot of variation year over year in how much Medicare has been reducing their readmission rates. So we decided to just go 1 year out and to set a single target for all hospitals for the first year, and I'll go into what that is. But that target was set because we think it will reasonably support both achieving the reduction that Medicare is going to have in the coming year, plus an additional amount to narrow the gap between where Maryland is and where Medicare is. We also said that the measures should be consistent with the CMS measure of readmissions. So just, it's readmissions as a percentile. It's not readmissions per 1,000 patients or another measure. Although as part of our monitoring for Maryland, we may be looking at other measures as well, because as fewer people come into the hospital, you might see, the percentage stay the same, but in fact the readmissions per 1,000 may be going down. All right, before I move on, I get a lot of questions about all of the different readmission measurement and reporting efforts that we have here at the HSCRC as well as with CRISP. And I just want to clarify, one, readmission revenue is the ARR methodology that had been applied to hospitals when they weren't under a global budget. And it was a voluntary program. And that used a different measure for readmissions. That was readmissions only to the same hospital, and it had a fixed 30-day window. So we're not talking about that measurement here. That measure is actually what is proposed to be used in the readmission shared savings program that is going to be voted on by the commission in the June meeting. And so again, this readmission shared savings program uses a different readmission measure. It uses the ARR measure. And this program is just where we sort of set ahead of time a set amount of shared savings that the state has to achieve through a reduction in readmissions. And then we take different amounts out for each hospital up front based upon what their readmission rate was in the previous year. Again, I'm not going to be covering this program in this webinar, and I do encourage you to follow the upcoming commission meeting to see whether this is approved and what rates are approved. Next, we also have been doing some reporting around potentially avoidable utilization, in particular in reference to how the global budgets will be updated with the demographic adjustment. This also looks at readmissions as one of the categories of potentially avoidable utilization. But it does use the same readmissions measure that we will be talking about today. However, in that case, we end up looking at the dollar amount associated and not just the rate of readmissions. And then finally, CRISP has been doing some reporting on readmissions using the admission, discharge, and transfer data. Okay. All right, I've been told by my IT person some of our slides aren't advancing. So I'm currently on slide 9. So I hope you are as well. If you're not, can you?
We're on slide 9.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Let me just look if. Okay, so I think we're doing okay, but I will try to periodically pause and make sure we're all on the same slide.
Yes, this is Diane. We've had several people say they're on slide 9, but one person says they can't hear the speaker, but it doesn't seem to be a problem for anyone else, so not sure what that problem is.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I guess if you can't hear me, though, I can't apologize. And I appreciate other people letting us know that that you can hear us. Okay. So again, what I was just mentioning briefly is that CRISP has been doing some readmissions reporting using the ADP data. And okay, let me close down my email before that pops up again. I don't know if you can see that, but and again, that uses the real-time ADP feeds to look at readmissions and not the same measure. However, Scott's going to talk about this at the end in terms of how we're going to work to align our measurements. Okay, so I'm pausing there, and I'm looking at the questions before I talk. Okay. So does anybody have any questions before I continue and talk about the readmissions targets for rate year 16? Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to continue. So this slide, excuse me, all right, there. Now we're on slide 11, and this just goes over the rate year 2016 details about the program. So again, the base period for measuring performance improvement will be calendar year 2013. The performance period will be calendar year 2014. And the uniform goal is for each hospital to reduce their readmission rate by 6.76%. Again, that was determined by looking at sort of how much, what was the reduction in readmissions for Medicare over the last few years, plus what we needed to do over that to kind of close that gap. So if you show a reduction of 6.76%, in rate year 2016, there's just a positive incentive where there'll be a 0.5% increase in permanent inpatient revenue, provided that the uptake factor is favorable, and there is no penalty in this case if you don't hit the 6.76%. We are going to monitor observation and ED visits, and if we see observation cases within 30 days increasing at a greater rate than overall observation cases, and yet you hit your readmissions reduction target, we may adjust this 0.5% to take into account, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so next I'm going to go into the measurement methodology. Do you have any, are there any questions at this point? I'm just going to pause about rate year 2016. Again, it's actually probably easiest if you type them rather than raising your hand, and we do have people monitoring the questions, so feel free to type them as they come to you, but I'm going to go ahead and continue. All right, so when I say reduction in readmissions, what I actually mean is the measure that's going to be used in this program is risk-adjusted readmission rate. And I'm going to walk through this calculation here, but essentially it's the observed over expected times the statewide unadjusted rate. What you should note, though, is that the rate is 30 days, so we're looking at readmissions within 30 days of a hospitalization. We're looking at all payer or all patients. This is all cause and not condition-specific readmissions, and it's all hospital, so both intra and inter-hospital. And we're able to do that by using the CRISP EID. So there have been some questions about both sort of the data source and how the time frames for measurement work. So I'm going to try to explain this. So first of all, we are going to be using the inpatient abstract or case mix data that you submit on the tapes along with the CRISP EID. We will be risk adjusting using the APR-DRG and severity of illness using the version 31 of the APR-DRG grouper. And again, it's discharge APR-DRG that we're using, not admission. And
Allison,
yes.
this is Ann. There were two questions that I want to make sure we capture. One is from Bernard Rabbits, and then one is from Meiji Zhang. But I'd like to ask Bernard, I'm going to unmute you, Bernard, and then if you could ask your question, please, through the audio.
Are you there?
Bernard, you should be unmuted right now. Hello, is Bernard there? Bernard Rabbits. Okay, Bernard, I'm going to mute you again. Please send me a chat message. We did see your hand up, and I didn't want to ignore your question. But we have an opportunity at a later point to circle back to it. Now I'm going to unmute Meiji.
Okay, well, so I can also repeat the questions that she had, and I'll be getting into this in a little bit. But the reduction target of 6.76% is in the risk-adjusted rate, not in the OE ratio. And hopefully that'll be clearer as I walk through. And then I have another question, is it 30 calendar days? And yes, it's 30 calendar days. It's not looked at hours. So what we do is we take the discharge date, and then we go 30 days out to calculate the date that that window spans and look for readmissions within that date. All right, I have another question here. How is readmission rates calculated for hospitals who reside along state borders where patients are excluded from CRISP? And that's a good question, and one of the reasons that this is, at this point, just an improvement program and not an attainment program is partially because we have to figure out a way to take into account out-of-state readmissions. However, Chris and Scott can touch base on this, is working with Delaware and Maryland and DC to try to capture those readmissions. We then would have to figure out how we might use that data. Scott, do you want to add anything right now on that, or do you want to wait till the end?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that, as Allison said, we are working with some of our neighboring states. 6 of the 8 district hospitals participate directly in CRISP and submit ADT data. And with Delaware, we've created a reciprocity agreement where any Maryland resident arrives at a Delaware hospital, those ADT messages will be routed to CRISP. There's obviously the significant shortcoming that there's not the equivalent of case mix data coming out of those states or the district, and so that there is some work to be done to create an ability to do a deeper readmission analysis across geography.
Right. So I think but it's something we can at least monitor somewhat. Is that correct, Scott?
To the extent that we do have ADT messages, there's an ability to see that someone that was discharged from a Maryland facility arrived at a district or Delaware facility. But there would be some gaps, certainly, with the other states, and to some extent in Delaware.
Okay. So I apologize. Some people are still having, so a follow-up question to that is what happens when the readmission is in Maryland? In that case, at this point, we're not going to know about the initial admission, so it's not going to be counted as a readmission. And again, that does mean that the hospitals that are on the border may be more likely to have that type of scenario. And one of the reasons that we're only looking at improvement and not at attainment is that we don't know what is a good readmission rate without better risk adjustment and without being able to account for out-of-state readmissions. So at this point, it's not going to count. Okay. So I apologize. It appears that some people are still having issues advancing the slides. I am on slide 14, and I I'm going to answer one more question, and then I'm going to continue with the slides, and then I'll take some more questions at the end. So I have another. Ricardo.
Let me address that. If you're, we seem to be having luck with people. If you click in the upper left corner, there's a little button called Zoom. If you zoom it to a different size, that seems to have taken care of it for someone else whose slide wasn't advancing. So maybe from 100 to 80%, if you do a zoom, it may take care of it.
Thank you, Diane. And again, I apologize for those of you who are having issues. All right, so Ricardo Berman wrote his question, and he wanted to know what diagnoses are included in the readmission measurement. So what if the patient was readmitted due to an infection and then is readmitted for gout? Does it count? In this case, yes, it's all-cause readmissions. So any reason that you come back in within 30 days, unless it's a planned admission, and I'm going to get into this, so I won't, I'm not going to go into that anymore, it will be included. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here because I think some of the questions I'm going to be answering as I go through the next few slides. So if you could just hold off, and then if I don't answer it, I'll be happy to come back. But again, I want to just walk through the measurement time frame because this has been somewhat of a source of confusion. So if, for example, we want to measure calendar year 2013, which is our base period, readmission rates, we're going to select all discharges within this date range, where the discharge date is between January 1st, 2013 and December 31st, 2013. We're also going to include an extra 30 days into January 2014 so that we can look for those 30-day readmissions from the December 2013 admissions. But we don't pick any admissions from this time period. So again, on a monthly basis, what that would look like is, you know, if we were going to say this is your January 2014 readmission rate, we would look at all discharges with a discharge date between January 1st and January 31st of 2014. And then we have to wait for 30 days of data in February of 2014 just to capture any readmissions that might occur. So we would look for readmissions both during January as well as the 30 days in February. Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm going to continue, and then I'm going to come back to the questions. Okay, so what are the adjustments to the readmission measurement? And I think this is going to answer some of your questions and get at some of your concerns. So first, we are removing planned readmissions, and we are using the CMS algorithm, version 2 of that algorithm, to identify planned readmissions. Plus, we have added the APR DRGs for vaginal and C-section deliveries, because those weren't all being captured by the CMS logic, so it's slightly modified. And this is something that, you know, we would change if CMS updated their logic, or if we saw other exceptions that were needed that were causing a large number of readmissions to be flagged, or a significant number. And then just to reiterate, those planned readmissions are removed from the numerator, so it's not counted as a readmission, but they still appear in the denominator since they could have a subsequent unplanned readmission after a planned admission. Okay? The other adjustments we do is we remove hospitalizations from the denominator when somebody dies, because they can't have a readmission. However, if that hospitalization occurred within 30 days of a previous hospitalization, it is counted as a readmission even though the patient died, because it was a readmission from the original admission. Now, we also are going to remove transfers. Same-day transfers don't count as a readmission. So in this case, the discharge date of the admission has to be the same as the admission date for the subsequent admission. So the date, the actual date has to be the same. And if that happens, then what happens is we only count them in the denominator one time. So, and we use the discharge date from the hospital where they were transferred to then calculate that 30-day window. So essentially that first admission is kind of taken out, and it's not counted as a readmission, and the discharge date isn't used for calculating the 30-day window. So it's essentially that first part of that whole hospitalization is excluded. And at this point, we aren't looking at, whether hospitals are marking where people are going to or coming from, although we are starting to audit those fields and to see if, we can get them to be consistent enough where we might be able to use that to determine transfers. But at this point, it's just discharge date equals admission date. We also exclude discharges from rehabilitation hospitals, but rehabilitation beds at acute hospitals are included. They are. Okay. All right, I'm going to go through the next slide, and then I'm going to get to questions really quickly. In addition to those exclusions that I just discussed, we also do some cleaning of the data. So first, we have to remove cases that don't have a CRISP EID. And at this point, our matching rate is over 99% as a state as a whole. And Scott will talk a little bit more about this. But for some hospitals, we periodically run into problems. So we have to remove any, though, that don't have an EID. We remove any cases that look like duplicates in the data or where, for some reason, there's a negative interval. So like the admission date comes after the discharge date. And again, we're working, to revise sort of the case mix edits to make sure that duplicates and negative intervals can't be submitted. But for now, and it's a very rare occurrence, but for now we just clean the data to remove all three of these things. Okay, so now I'm going to pause because there's been a flurry of questions, and I'm going to scroll up and try to answer them. Okay. The first question was, when patients are transferred to another facility, is the correct disposition transfer? Okay. So again, we're not using the discharge disposition to identify a transfer at this point. And you wanted to know if it was transfer or transfer with planned readmission. That transfer with planned readmission is something that is new to Medicare and is for specific DRGs at this point only, and we're working to also collect that data and working on whether we'll do it only for those specific DRGs or more broadly. But at this point, it's my understanding we're mapping, if you do transfer with planned readmission, simply back to transfer. The next question is, do you know if the patients at the hospitals okay, so this is asking about whether or not we know if they went to the ED first and then were sent home instead of being admitted. And again, I'll get into this a little. We are going to monitor both observation status and ED visits within 30 days of a hospitalization. So that might get at that, but I don't know the answer to the question about the Medicare pneumonia rate specifically. Okay, so then we have a question about the planned readmissions and the APR DRGs that we're using to remove pregnancies. We'll look back at them and make sure we have the right ones and make sure and look at these additional APR DRGs of 541 and 542.
On the next question, Allison, it's from Amy Deutschendorf via Kathy Kernan's phone. So I'm going to unmute Kathy real quick, okay?
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, Kathy, you're unmuted.
Thanks, Diane. This is Amy. So I had asked Allison this last week, with using the CMS planned exclusions, are you using the complete algorithm for that, which is if they have this index and this readmit, they're considered planned, but if they have X index admission and X readmit, it's unplanned?
Yes, we're using the whole, the entire CMS algorithm with that one, with those couple of additions.
Okay, okay, that's pretty complex.
Yep.
Okay, was curious about that. And then the expected rate, is that calculated off the base year?
Yes, that's calculated off of the base year norms, and I have slides that will talk about that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And again, you know, this is something that can be that CMS is probably working if there are updates, as well as, we've applied this fix with the APR DRGs for deliveries. There may be other things we look to in the future. Okay, so there are some other questions here. Another question is from Tony Calabria. If there is a planned transfer and the patient leaves one hospital before midnight and arrives at the other hospital after midnight, so again, there are possibilities where the discharge date and the admissions date may not be equal, but it may technically be a transfer. So just as you're suggesting, somebody leaves one hospital at 11:55 and is discharged on January 1st, enters the other hospital at 12:01 and is admitted on January 2nd, that in our case would come up as not looking like a transfer. And again, we don't have the, well, I would need, at this point, we're looking at trying to audit the, again, those where people are being sent and where they're being received to try to see if we can look at it differently. But in that case, yes, it would be counted as a readmission. Will intra-hospital discharges, this is from Andrea Horton, will intra-hospital discharges and admissions to different services within the hospital count as readmissions? And again, no, as long as the discharge and the admission date, if they are separate, and I apologize, I don't know, are the same, are on the same day. And if it's within the hospital, it's not looked at at all. Yes. Okay. Next, they want to know how, Mitchell Schwartz wants to know how a patient in hospice is counted in the readmissions methodology. And I would have to specifically look into that. I haven't looked at the CMS planned readmissions logic to see if there's anything in there around hospice care and whether that's counted as planned. But I can look into that and let people know. Then we have a question from Rich Pellegrino. With respect to the time frame of analyzing the data, in theory, will we always be behind 1 month? And yes, so for example, we can't analyze readmissions until after June data has been submitted because of the 30-day act. And that is correct, and that's one of the reasons why the monthly reports you're going to be getting going forward are always 1 month behind what you're getting, what the HSCRC provides for some of our other quality programs like the MHAP program. And then we have a question from Marjorie Fuller. Are there any exceptions for psych, addiction, non-compliant patients that may require repeated admissions? And again, the only exceptions we make are for planned readmissions at this point, as well as same-day transfers. And and Laura Hooper had a question about the data from CMS early in the presentation and where she could find where her hospitals rank. I will have to, Laura, get back to you on that. I don't know the answer. Then there was a follow-up. Once we look into hospice, I will email everybody, as well as I said, we are going to set up the readmission reduction incentive program website, and I'll make sure some of these things are included on there. Okay? So with that, I'm going to continue just in the interest of time because we're going to be running short. So this next slide just goes to how we do the risk-adjusted calculation. So first, what we have to do is calculate the statewide unadjusted or the crude readmission rate. And that's just the total number of readmissions over the total number of discharges with all of those exclusions we mentioned. Then for each hospital, we have to calculate the number of observed readmissions over the period of interest, calculate the number of expected readmissions based upon discharge APR, GRG, and SOI. And on the next slide, I'll go through how we calculate that, or I'll try to for you. And then we calculate the ratio of observed to expected. So if you have the exact number of observed as were expected, your ratio would be 1. If it's greater than 1, that means you had fewer observed and, you had more observed and fewer expected. If it was less than 1, that meant you had less observed than was actually expected given your case mix. We then multiplied this ratio by that statewide unadjusted rate to get the hospital-specific risk-adjusted readmission rate. Okay? and again, I will walk through this in a little bit more detail when I actually open up the Excel sheet, but in general, if you see a hospital's unadjusted rate go up when we risk adjust, that means that compared to the rest of the state, your patients at that hospital are somewhat healthier in terms of the APR, DRG, and severity of illness cells than the rest of the state. So let me now try to walk through how we calculate the expected values. I will say that there's a lot more detail on this in the memo that I sent out in the Appendix A, or Appendix 1. And so if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them, but I suggest you have to read this. Essentially, though, the expected values are the number of readmissions that a hospital would have experienced, given its case mix, had its rate of readmissions been identical to a normative set of hospitals, or in our case, compared to the state average. So what we do, and this is an example where if we pretend there's just one APR DRG category and 4 severity of illness levels. So this is just example data for one hospital. So what we show here is that this is the number of discharges the hospital had for each severity of illness level and the number of discharges, and then their rate of discharges. This normative column then is what was the rate for this APR DRG SOI cell for the entire state. So for the entire state, it was 7%. So if you take 7%, multiply it by 200, that's the number of discharges that hospital had, they should have had 14 readmissions, is what this is telling you. Okay? As you see, they only had 10, so they had fewer than was expected. What you do is cross all the APR DRG and all the SOI cells, is then you add up the expected number to get that expected number of readmissions that's used in the calculation. So they had 45, but they were expected to have 56.5. You then would calculate the ratio of 45 over 56.5 and multiply it by the state average to get the risk-adjusted rate. Now, as I mentioned before, we are going to be monitoring observation and ED visits within 30 days of an inpatient hospitalization. And specifically, just for observation, and just because hospitals are using observation status differently, we may make an adjustment to the positive incentive. So if somebody achieves their readmissions reduction target, but we see that within 30 days of hospitalization, their observation rates went up dramatically and went up more than their use of observation status did for the hospital overall, we may adjust that 0.5%, and you may not get the full 0.5%. We are working, once we have the outpatient CRISP EIDs, we'll be working to add to the monthly data that we send out some of the information on 30-day observation rates and ED rates. Also, in the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief, but we have ongoing work because this program right now is for rate year 16, but we need to be looking forward to performance period of calendar year 2015. So we need to be looking at what are the changes we're going to be making to the program in the future. And some of the things we're looking into is how we might risk adjust on different factors, such as socio-demographic factors, and this is something that the performance measurement work group is actively looking at. We have to work on figuring out what we might be able to do with out-of-state readmissions. And then if we had proper adjustments for these things, whether or not we would want to include both improvement as well as attainment in the model. So right now there are some hospitals who are doing very, very well who aren't going to have the same opportunity for improvement necessarily. And so it may be hard for them to hit the 6.76%. However, that's one of the reasons we don't have a negative penalty at this point. And given the high rates of readmissions, the staff and the work group felt, at least in the first year, that a set target, one target of 6.76% for all hospitals was appropriate. But going forward, we're going to need to continue to work to set what's going to be the target for rate year 2017 and potentially beyond, and what are some of these other changes we may need to make. All right, so now what I actually want to do is switch and open up the Excel workbook that we've been sending out we sent out for January preliminary and February preliminary data at this point. And then after I walk through this, I will go back to the timeline for when you should be receiving these reports, and then turn this over to Scott to just briefly talk about the CRISP EIDs. I'm then going to take all of the remaining questions kind of at the end in the interest of time, because some people may need to leave at noon. So you should be able to see now the Excel workbook that we sent out. If you go to the first tab, it's the cover sheet, and it just tells you what's included and gives you, again, the base year, performance year version of the software and what's included in the book. The second tab here is just your base period information with what your calendar year 2014 performance goal is. So it shows you the number of eligible discharges. Those are discharges eligible for readmission. So, deaths and other things have been removed. The number of readmissions you had during calendar year 2013. Again, the exclusions applied. Your unadjusted rate. Your number of expected. That's here in column F. So as you can see for Meredith, which I always pick on, so I apologize, they had an expected number of over 2,000, and they had an actual number of only 1,873. So that gives them a ratio of 0.92. That is then multiplied by the statewide average, which if you go down here is 12.41% for calendar year 13, to get their risk-adjusted rate. Based upon that, we've then calculated that the goal for them to achieve is 10.59%, or 6.76% less. Okay? Next, this third tab has the same base period information as well as the preliminary data, in this case for January and February. So again, what you can see is this is how many discharges they've had just in this preliminary data for the first 2 months. And based upon that, we've calculated that their risk-adjusted rate is 10.01%, or 0.08%. So that's actually lower than the goal over here in column I, and that's lower by about 0.5%. So again, what you want to see are negative numbers in this column. That means you're doing better than what you what the goal is. But again, remember this is all preliminary data, and as some people, if you look down, may be aware, we have just fixed an issue with one hospital's EIDs where they weren't coming through, and so once we apply that fix, it's potential that other hospitals' rates will change ever so slightly, although probably not significantly. This last tab, tab 4, this is just what we've always provided, which is the norms that you could apply if you had an at-risk population where you wanted to calculate on your own your expected numbers. And then in addition to this report being sent on a monthly basis, some of the hospital people will also receive case-level information. And again, we're working on sending that out. We had to make the adjustment for that one hospital, so we can send it out again for all of the base period of calendar year 13, as well as for the performance period. And this just shows you what's in the case level file, and that would be, what the hospital was, the admission and discharge date of the initial hospitalization, and the discharge APR, DRG, SOI level. We then look at whether or not they were eligible. We flag if that hospitalization was eligible for a readmission. So, for instance, if the person died in the hospitalization, then that would be 0, because they wouldn't be eligible for readmission. We then flag if it's a planned admission, so you can be able to see what our logic using CMS logic is for identifying planned admissions. We then look at whether for that admission there's a readmission within 30 days, what the DRG and SOI was for the readmission, as well as whether the hospital ID. So you can look at whether they went to your hospital or they went to another hospital. Okay, I'm going to pause there and try to look if there are specific questions about this cover sheet, although, you know what, I'm actually going to first present this next slide because this will give you the timelines that we have been working with CRISP and with St. Paul to agree upon. So this is just for Q2 of fiscal year 2014. Hospitals submitted their April data on May 15th, so 15 days after the end of the month. That data is then sent takes about 5 days or 4 days for St. Paul to process that data and send it to both the HSCRC and CRISP. However, at that point, it won't have yet the CRISP EID. So the HSCRC can use it for other quality programs like MHAC, but we can't use it yet for the readmissions. That's why there's a bit of a delay on sending out the monthly MHAC reports. Will come out before the readmissions reports. Then we expect to get the EID data from CRISP within about a week, or about a week after they get the data. We then take a couple of days to assure the quality of the matching. Well, Scott will mention CRISP provides some reports on the % matching of MRNs to EIDs. We also validate that on our end, and then that takes about total for us a week to both do the data quality checks and then produce the readmission reports. So you should be getting the readmission reports for April's preliminary data by June 5th. Okay, again, the reporting is dependent on all hospitals submitting the data on time, so there are times in which we grant exceptions to when the data has to come into St. Paul, and then also on the CRISP EID matching. However, I will say that what we've decided to do is that we will continue to produce these reports even if there are issues with the EID matching, but we are then going to reach out to the hospitals, the HSCRC and CRISP. If any hospital is below 99.5% of matching we will reach out and work with those hospitals to improve that matching rate and then update the data. Okay. I'm receiving a call. I thought maybe we cut out again like last time. All right, I'm going to pause there and try to look at the questions. First of all, I will send out a copy of the presentation slides to everybody who is on this webinar, and as well as we will post it on the website when we get that set up, and anyone can email me for copies. And then another question from Kathy Talbot. Does the file, and I think this means, does the file provided to hospitals provide a statewide readmission rate by DRG and severity? I think that would be the norms file. We at least have it for calendar year 2013 included, because essentially for each APR DRG cell, that's what the norms is. If you're wanting it for the performance period, we'd have to look into that, but maybe you can clarify that for me as I move on to another question. Another question from Andrea Horton is, for observation utilization, will you be looking at historical patterns of use? And yes, I think we'll look both at historical as well as sort of comparing, like I said, the use of observation within the 30 days compared to the rate of hospitalization or use of observation overall for that hospital. Okay, and then Kathy clarified that no, we've answered the norms question. So yes, we do provide essentially the rate of readmissions for each APR, DRG, SOI level in that norms file. Okay, so with that, Scott, I'm going to switch to the next slide and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Allison. So many of you on the phone are certainly familiar with CRISP reporting, but I wanted to provide just a little bit of clarification in terms of the unique ID creation and assignment process, and then just briefly reference back to something Allison presented earlier on the ADT-based readmission reports that we've historically created and that we'll likely be moving away from. At base here, this first bullet, we receive real-time ADT messages for all inpatient, outpatient, including ER visits from all hospitals in the state. That's what allows us to create the unique ID, leveraging our master patient index, which is an IBM Initiate product. And that essentially cross-references any local hospital medical record number with other medical record numbers linking to that unique CRISP ID that we create. Our process then to link that to the case mix data is based on using common elements that are in both the ADT messages as well as the case mix data and that's the facility ID and the medical record number. So by using the facility ID and the medical record number, we can essentially join the CRISP ID to the case mix record so that if there were a patient at 2 different hospitals, the unique CRISP ID is now correlated to that individual. As Allison referenced, on occasion, we will not get 100% EID assignment rate for each hospital. For the majority of hospitals, we do. So every single visit will have a unique ID assigned. But in some cases, there may be a certain visit that for some reason doesn't flow through to CRISP in any ADT event, and therefore we don't have a unique ID created. Those are few and far between, and occasionally there are one-off issues that we need to address. And to do so, we typically reach out to a hospital. Some of you have been through this for prior years, where we will share the HSCRC will share the medical record number and the facility ID back to the hospital. If those demographics are then sent to CRISP, we can create the unique ID and close that gap. Next slide, Alice. So as I mentioned, historically, before CRISP started working with the HSCRC to link the unique ID to the case mix data, we were able to essentially mimic visits by taking all of the ADTs for a given encounter and applying hospital-specific logic that we created to turn it into an admission and discharge, creating inter-hospital readmission reports that we shared with hospitals throughout the state. That wasn't a report that went to the HSCRC, but was meant to demonstrate a capability to the hospital community that CRISP could create these inter-hospital reports, whether that's readmissions or otherwise. The challenge with those reports is that the visit creation process, while pretty accurate, wasn't exactly the same as the visits that are submitted in the case mix data. And moreover, the logic that we used, because we were doing inter-hospital, was not ARR logic at the time and was not aligned with the now CMS logic. And so the numbers were slightly different. Moving forward, because we are able to link the CRISP ID to the case mix data, we are able to use that as the underlying starting point for visits. And we have taken the CMS logic that Allison has walked through and coded that into our reporting infrastructure with the underlying goal of being able to produce hospital-specific and MRN drill-down, readmission, and other reports that are exactly the same as you would see in terms of what the HSCRC can run internally. The important concept to understand here is that there is the same set of data within the HSCRC that includes the CRISP ID as there is within the CRISP reporting infrastructure, case mix data plus CRISP ID, so that reports can be generated. And our objective in partnering with both the hospital community and the HSCRC is to ensure that any report we run is both well understood in terms of the underlying data it's run off of and the logic used to create the report, but also creates the same output so that everyone's working off the same numbers. So I'll stop there, Allison, and if there are questions either you or other folks on the line have, I'm happy to answer them along the way.
No, I mean, I think, though, as we mentioned, we had set a threshold for matching, and we will be reaching out to the hospitals that don't meet that threshold, correct, with you?
That's right. That's okay. Exactly.
That threshold is, again, what we're stating is 99.5%. And just to reiterate, we're not going to stop putting out the preliminary monthly reports, in part because we want you to have the case level files. And it's sort of my understanding or my thinking that, you know, if you don't have the CRISP IDs matching, they're going to undercount readmissions rather than, let's say, overcount. And so in that case, we will, we still want you to see the readmissions that you really did have. But we do have a question from Marjorie Fuller about how are the errors going to be addressed with regards to the CRISP ID when real-time error occurs. For example, if multiple Mary Smiths and wrong ID assigned. And then, so Scott, are you able to see this question?
Yeah. No, I can't, but I think I understand the direction of the question. So if errors occur within a hospital, we receive all ADTs, and that includes MRN update messages, so what are called ADT A08 messages that may update content within a message, or merge messages if you realize you've assigned two different MRNs and have a duplicate record. And those flow all the way through to our MPI, so that any action you take locally is replicated in real time as you take that action, or minutes later in our data set.
Okay, and then we did have a question. When will Chris make available the CMS readmission logic reports for each hospital?
Yes. So as Amy pointed out earlier, the logic is complicated. We are coding it from SAS into SQL logic. Just to be fully transparent, we've completed the logic creation process. It's in QA now, and we're working with the HSCRC just to make sure that we've gotten it absolutely accurate. So we are in QA now. I'd like to give you a definitive date. I typically use within the next 30 days. I'm hoping that's the case, but we're right around the corner.
Okay, and again, you know, that we originally were going to have you guys doing the reporting, but because we were still working on validating the logic across between us, that's why we are now sending out monthly preliminary reports, and you should be getting the next report by the end of June. I mean, in the next week, by the end of the week. Okay, so with that, are the people? We're past our time, so I apologize for going over. I can stay on the line for a little bit if there are additional questions. However, you can also email the HSCRC quality email address that's listed here if you either have questions that didn't get answered or if you think of questions. And, you know, I will work to clarify specifically, I know the hospice information issue, and then I'll look back through the questions and see which other ones we need to send updates on. We will also be setting up the website. Hopefully we can do that soon, by the end of the week preferably, in which case we will then post the slides. However, I will send to everybody who registered for the webinar and attended the webinar a copy, so you have the copy of the final slides. All right, I'm just pausing again. I don't see any additional questions. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and all of the hard work that you guys are doing to improve the quality of care for people in Maryland, specifically in this case around readmissions. So with that, I want to say thank you again, and I will sign off.